University. Thanks so much for coming out. I know this is a really busy time of the semester. I'd like to thank the Henning Institute, the Kevin School of Education, and the Honors Program for sponsoring this event, and of course, especially Ted Sukahara for making it happen. Where is he? There he is. Thank you, Ted. I'd also like to acknowledge President Donahue. Thank you for being here. And thanks especially to retired Congressman from the 11th District, the Honorable George Miller. The format of tonight is a conversation on the stated theme, the liberal arts and the modern university. I will introduce the guests and I will ask a few questions, which may lead to more questions and conversation. And then at some point I will open up the conversation to the audience. So I will introduce our guests while I'm still standing up here and then go sit down and start asking questions. So first, our Stanton Hales served as president of the College of Wooster from 1995 to 2007, and prior to that for 5 years at Wooster as Wooster's vice president for academic affairs. He was also a professor of mathematics and associate dean of the college at Pomona College, where he received the Rudolph J. Wigg Distinguished Professorship Award. Dr. Hales currently serves as a senior vice president at Academic Search, a national higher education executive search and leadership development firm. Catharine Bond-Hill became the 10th president of Vassar College in July 2006. She is a noted economist whose work focuses on higher education affordability and access, as well as on economic development and reform in Africa. Under President Hill's leadership, Vassar has reinstated need-blind admissions and replaced loans and grants in financial aid for low-income families. President Hill has been selected for a number of scholarly awards, grants, and fellowships from organizations including the American Council of Learned Societies, the Brookings Institution, National Science Foundation, and the Social Science Research Council. So please welcome our two guests to St. Mary's. Thank you. I'm going to ask some questions to begin, and I think the first one I want to ask, I guess, just Catherine first. What does a president do?
Do I have to turn something on, or is it?
Press the white button.
I think it's
Press
there.
the white button.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would say that as a college president, I do everything. Everything from storing students' stuff in our basement to teaching classes to meeting with students about just about any issue that's on their mind. I think that's partly the result of being at a liberal arts college, and I'll see if Stan thinks the same thing. But ultimately, the responsibility of the president is to think about the mission of the institution, and doing that, conversing with alums and faculty and students, and then making sure that we stay true to that mission, keep it moving, find the resources to implement that mission, and make sure we're doing everything we can to accomplish it.
Stan?
When I think about that question, and I have over the years, I have sort of three responses. The first response is one I think that probably Catherine has to do sometimes, and that is the facetious one, because that often can at least get people laughing a bit and thinking. So the first answer I often give is that as a president, we herd cats. And in addition to that, we do our very best, but usually unsuccessfully, to stay out of trouble. And so herding cats and staying out of trouble is a first easy but somewhat facetious answer. Second answer I often give is I try to pick maybe a small number of other titles that describe what we do. And the title, each of these four titles I'll give, could be interpreted too specifically, but they're meant to be quite general in what they mean. And I guess the terms that I use are architect, cheerleader, taskmaster, and ambassador. And I could pretty much characterize everything that I felt that I tried to do, at least at Wooster, in one of those categories. Obviously, architect writ large rather than designing buildings specifically. Same thing with the others. And then the third piece of the answer is thinking about on a day-to-day, year-to-year basis, what are the most important things? And at least for me, it was hiring the best people I could find for the jobs working with me and mentoring and supporting them to the best of my ability. Secondly, asking all the questions that would seem to be important, especially the hard questions, and then being willing to make the hard decisions when necessary. So that's the way I describe what the job is like.
Thank you. I have maybe one other kind of large question, and feel free to expand as much and for as long as you'd like about this. From your perspectives now, today, what makes you optimistic about higher education, and what worries you the most? Often when you ask presidents what they do, they say worry, stay up all night thinking about things. But if there are things like that, what's the top of the list right now?
So I would say I do worry about our country in that we have stalled in terms of educational attainment at the post-secondary level. Having had a century really of where that rate has gone up, and it's been a source of not only economic growth in our society, but I think well-being for many of the members of our country. And that's now stalled now for quite a while. And if you take a look at who's going on to higher education, what you see is that it actually matters incredibly importantly on both your race and your income. So if we thought that this was somehow kind of a fair game where people were going on to higher education based on their merits, the data don't suggest that. And that stalling in educational attainment is taking place right at the time where for the last 30 years, the returns to getting a higher education degree have gone up significantly. So in a way, our country's commitment to equal opportunity and social mobility have significantly declined over the last 30 or 40 years. And access to that economic mobility and social mobility is more important now than ever. 30, 40 years ago, if you were, had a high school degree and went and got a job, you could make a good middle income living. And the difference between what you could do for your family and what families that went on and got higher education could do weren't so different. Now the gap between those things are huge, and access to that doesn't appear to be fair anymore. So I think that's a real challenge that our nation is facing, and am I optimistic? I guess I'm actually not optimistic. But I'm hopeful that if we can understand the problem, that enough people in our society are ultimately fundamentally committed to this notion of economic mobility and equal opportunity, that we'll figure out a way to regain it and have it be part of our fabric.
Okay, before can I just ask you to just expand a tiny bit on what are, from your perspective, what are the obstacles that have to do with race and income?
Well, first of all, I think those two in our society are pretty highly correlated. I think it's in a way been a little bit of an exogenous shock to our system in that there's been technological advancement that has resulted in high returns to skilled labor, which is different than it was 50 years ago. That's led to some income inequality, and then the income inequality itself is exacerbating things. If you think about higher income families, they're investing hugely in their kids. They're choosing to live in places where the schools are better, or if not, they're sending them to private independent schools that are both costly but a wonderful education. They're doing enrichment in the summer. They're doing, extracurricular activities, sports, athletics, music. So when they get to the point of applying to college, these kids have had a lot of resources invested in them, and they're very talented. So I think in many ways, partly the increasing income inequality has resulted in different amounts of investment in kids that correlates with income and race. And so it's not a level playing field the way that it was before. So I think part of the solution is greater investment all along the pipeline, from literally probably prenatal care, through college. Just a minor note of optimism. I do think that the American higher education system is fascinating in that there's so many different types of higher education, and you have a variety of points of access. And so if it doesn't work the first time, you have additional shots at it. Whereas in many countries, if you don't do well on that one test, literally, that may be your last point of entry into the system. So again, I think investing right across the board and giving students and young adults lots of opportunities to get access, to get what they need is a little ray of hope, I think, in the American system.
Stan? Yeah.
I think that the basis for my general overall optimism, and maybe I'm a little more optimistic than Catherine has said, but maybe we're similar, but I think the first basis for me is the evident and generally accepted need broadly for education, higher level education, college education across the board in many areas. If we were in a declining industry, buggy whips or something that people clearly don't need anymore, it would be very discouraging. But we're in an industry which is extremely important, and the need for which is recognized very broadly. So I think that's the basis of my overall optimism. But then beyond that, it is people, different kinds of people, that are both the source of my optimism and my own pessimism when it comes. As far as the optimism, I'm fortunate to work with a huge range of institutions in the work I do now in helping them hire presidents and vice presidents and provosts and deans. And so I'm very fortunate to come into contact on a regular basis all year with people, good people working at a very broad range of institutions, from the poorest to the richest, from the least known to the best known. And unfortunately in higher education, there is a bit of a pecking order, and the richer, better known schools tend to look down at the lesser schools and make assumptions that some of the people running those lesser schools are also subhuman in some ways. That is, they don't have respect for them. What I have found hugely optimistic, at least for my own self, is seeing a remarkably broad and strong set of individual people working across the board in institutions of every sort, poor, rich, rural, urban, suburban, in circumstances which are definitely not ideal or well supported. But their level of optimism and their level of effort and hard work and dedication is, at least from my point of view, hugely reassuring every day to see such a huge number of people working so hard and so effectively in every kind of institution. To me, that's just a very strong source of optimism. At the same time, I do get to run into people who are ideologues and who are misguided in their efforts and are probably much more selfish and interested in themselves than in the work they're doing and the people for whom they're working. And that's where I get worried, to see people that have perhaps influence in certain areas when I think their own motivations are suspect. And so that's the source of the pessimism that I sometimes see.
Thank you. Okay, my next question is about the cost of university education or college education. What makes college cost what it costs?
So the first thing, just the cost is what it takes to produce a year of education.
Excuse me. Yeah.
The price is what we charge a full pay kid, and the net price would be what a kid or student pays after need-based financial aid. I think the reason the cost has gone up, so what it costs to produce a year of education, is partly what I was talking about before with increasing income inequality. Higher education is one of the most skilled-based industries in the country. I think one or two of the others are dental practices and law firms. And the return to skilled labor has gone up. So our major input, which is skilled labor, has become more costly in this economy. So I think that's one thing on the cost.
And where is that skilled labor located?
it's faculty and administrators and staff, from technology to library to your faculty members. And if we want to be able to recruit folks to come and work in our industry, we have to pay the rate in the market, and that's gone up, but we have not had any productivity advances so that we can use less of that skilled labor. So that's 2/3 of our costs are people compensation, so I think that's part of it. But I think there's another important component here, at least for our sector of the market, and then I'll come to price in a minute. Increasing income inequality has meant that there's a segment of high school graduates and families who are going on to college who are actually have done amazingly well in the last 40 years in the United States. Those families are the ones that are investing in their kids. They want small classes. They want great faculty. They want good food. They want organic lawn care. They want turf fields. And our schools compete for those students, and so we supply some of those services, and that pushes up our costs more. On the price side, across all of American higher education, I think it's really the publics where prices have been going up more rapidly than at the private nonprofits. And that's happened because of a pullback in public support on the part of states, partly responding to voters. Need-based financial aid at our kinds of schools, it's probably cheaper to go to Vassar or Wooster with a full need-based financial aid package than it is to go to a public right now.
Like Ohio State.
Yeah. So it's a very complicated landscape. Costs are definitely up, but net prices for many families are down. But the publics, where 85% of students are educated, prices are up, and there isn't as much need-based financial aid. So middle and lower income families are getting squeezed out of higher education.
To pick up on one of the comments that Catherine made at the very beginning, the fact that the cost of faculty members with expertise has gone up. In the broader context, in some ways, it's probably worth saying it's about time, because for many years, from the 20s and 30s and 40s through the 50s, college faculty were woefully underpaid relative to their capabilities and training. And so in some ways, at least fortunately for them, but maybe not so fortunate for the public, salaries have finally, in many ways, caught up to what one might think highly trained and educated faculty members ought to be making, when in fact it was essentially poverty level until one got into the 70s and 80s. Until maybe Sputnik areas, 50s, 60s maybe too, but faculty salaries were just woefully low. And so finally, yes, the cost has gone up, for example, of that. But there are lots of other reasons. Of course, there are various federal requirements for reporting, and so administrative personnel gone way up to meet this requirement and that requirement. Unfortunately, faculty used to do some of that, but it's become too technical. So one needs a set of accountants almost to file some federal report. So that adds to the cost. There are various other kinds of professionalization, competition. Clients, some faculty, some parents and students have expectations for a level of luxury, unfortunately now, at college that certainly were not expectations. We can all think of those such things. I'm old enough to remember that my residence hall room had linoleum floors and no curtains, and we had to bring our own sheets and wash them. I mean, they were just a shade better than jail cells at the time, and hence the cost was quite low to build and maintain such things. I will have to admit that residence halls now don't look like jail cells.
Part of our audience is laughing because it actually does feel a little bit like that here.
But it's a whole series of
form.
things like that. And competition, of course, that leads into that.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just ask one more question about in the realm of price and cost. What are some of the tactics or challenges around making college affordable? And I guess just listening to the comments that were made earlier, I would say, what are the variables that go into, I don't know how else to say it, differential net price, I guess, or what are the trade-offs that you're making when you're thinking about charging different people different amounts and so on?
Yeah. So I actually was in favor of the the work of the Obama administration trying to tie some kind of ranking or evaluation of colleges to the amount of resources that were allocated to need-based financial aid and making college affordable. Because in the end, the federal government is actually allocating to private nonprofits and publics significant federal dollars in a variety of ways, through direct grants, through access to federal loans, through special tax treatment. And it seems okay to me for the federal government then to ask in exchange whether colleges are achieving the purposes of those transfers. And I think one of the main reasons that the government is involved in higher education is this notion of commitment to equal opportunity. And so asking whether we're actually behaving in a way that supports that seems reasonable to me. So the problem is that absent incentives to do that, every dollar that an institution allocates to need-based financial aid doesn't go to something else. And that something else can contribute to increasing the quality of the program in other ways. And so every institution is always balancing those things. And I think it would actually be good if there were more incentives to push us in the direction of allocating more to need-based financial aid.
Of course, when you think about affordability, there are always, in any budget, two sides to the equation, the revenue side and the expense side. And if you can perhaps make it affordable by looking at ways to improve both sides with respect to the cost. On the revenue side, of course, a stronger endowment provides greater income to the institution so that they can use that for scholarship support and so forth. And good examples are some of the wealthier places, billion-dollar endowments, who can give, in fact, full scholarships to students with no loans whatsoever. My own alma mater is fortunately able to do that. Pomona, there is no loan. The endowment's big enough so that everyone gets a scholarship with no loan attached. And so they can attract strong students. But I think there should probably be some greater effort to think about certain kinds of tax treatments and other things to help a larger number of colleges strengthen their endowment so they would have that additional stream of income for that purpose. So that's one effect on the revenue side. On the expense side, I guess the words I would think of are simplicity and efficiency. Trying to do what one can, in fact, to have an operation which is academically and intellectually strong, but not necessarily overly luxurious and expensive in those other ways. And there are certain colleges, of course, that even go beyond that. The work colleges like Berea in Kentucky, there's a very, very small staff beyond the faculty, because the students effectively undertake all the rest of the work. The students do all the gardening, they do all the building cleaning, they do all the rest. And so rather than students have to worry about getting a job off campus, they work on campus, yet the expense structure of the institution is enormously smaller because as a work college, except for the faculty, there is almost nobody else because there are people, the students are doing the rest of that work. And these places are very effective and don't cost too much.
I'm going to ask one more question, and so that's my way of asking the audience to start preparing to come up with questions. And I will just say now that there's a microphone in the middle. We can hand that microphone around, or wonderful if people could stand up and go to it. And I'll ask Stan to start, just to break it up a little bit. Part of the title of this panel has to do with the future of the liberal arts. Or liberal arts education, and I guess I'm fumbling around a little bit because the first thing I'd like to ask is to provide your own definition of what a liberal arts education is. No small task, I know. And then reflect a little bit, for each of you, please reflect a little bit on its evolution, its future, its value. Is that complicated enough?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sir.
Okay.
I'll try to make my answer not too complicated, but. And I'm not a philosopher, I'm a mathematician, yet there are certain aspects of this that have interested me for a long time. And a lot of it goes back to the Latin roots of all of this. Liberal arts, of course, comes from the Latin phrase artes liberalis. And it doesn't really mean liberal arts, it means liberating arts. And these are skills which liberate the mind from narrowness and bias and so forth. And of course, the ancients had this broken down into a small section of items, the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, mathematics, astronomy, music, and philosophy, I guess, really. But if you look at those items, they really are focused on three very simple things. The grammar, logic, and rhetoric talk about words. Words in sort of in status, and or static words, I guess. Words in place, and then words in action. Rhetoric or words in action, grammar and logic, words in sort of at their position. Mathematics or numbers at rest, music or numbers in motion. That's the way many people would think of music. I guess astronomy are objects in motion, and the other part are objects at rest. So we're talking about the most basic things we study: words, numbers, and objects, and how they behave. And to me, the liberal arts, the liberating arts that we try to teach are the most natural and direct outgrowth of the most basic study of words and numbers and objects and the implications they have for our lives. And so I think, at least my opinion, is that everything we do should be easily connected to that very basic sense of our world. And so it's, I think, that's where my first thought comes from. But now, right now, of course, unfortunately, at least from my point of view, the greater emphasis nationwide, and it's in the paper every day, is an attempt to tie all college education or all higher education. And I would back up and ask a question: can you call those the same? Is college education higher education, or is some college education not yet really higher? But nevertheless, to try to tie it all to the first job. And in fact, some people would like to rate colleges by the average salary of the graduate's first job. Nothing could make me more angry than to suggest that the value of a liberal arts college has anything to do whatsoever with the salary of a student's first job. To me, there's almost no connection there of any value whatsoever. I'm biased about this, I know. If there is to be any connection between an education and an educational institution and employment, it ought to be only with the student's last job. And the entire design of a liberal arts college education ought to be aimed at preparing a student for the broad general leadership obligations they will have in their last job. And in fact, probably their last job will have very little to do with their first job in the first place. So it's almost a waste of time to worry about the effect of the college education on the first job. It all ought to be aimed at the kind of skills and talents that you would expect your graduates to have to exercise in their last job. And so that's, I guess, to me, the foundation of everything I think is most important in a liberal arts education.
Yeah, so I would concur. I think about the liberal arts as being basically students learning how to read and write and do quantitative analysis, and that can take a variety of different forms. But basically, it's working with students so that they can learn how to think and solve problems, and also continue to learn over their lifetimes. And I agree that there's now this incredible emphasis on earnings and getting jobs. Again, I think that's partly coming from this increased income inequality, because actually getting a job that gets you into that top 10% of the income distribution is incredibly important today in a way that it wasn't 40 or 50 years ago. But I think the emphasis on the first job is very misleading, because it used to be a long time ago, whatever that first job was in that industry might be where you stayed for your career. Those days are completely over. And in fact, getting trained for a very particular job is probably the best way to end up without a job and being unemployable, because just jobs are changing so incredibly rapidly. 10 years now, 15 years from now, we don't even know what the jobs are going to be. So we definitely have to change and think about educating our students to be kind of intellectually nimble so that they can adjust as the world around them adjusts. Having said that, I do think that there's, and this is just part of the escalation of costs. I think when I was in school and it was time to go look for a job, there was a binder over in the alumni office where I could go look through and find a few phone numbers and addresses of alums to get in touch with. Now I think it has become part of our responsibility to help students transition to that first job. And it's not so much, I don't think that we're educating them for that first job, it's just that there is some expectation that we will help them make that first transition.
Okay, we're waiting for questions.
Good evening. Thanks
Hi.
for joining us. The question I have is, I read that at Vassar you have 98% of all your students living on campus. What kind of benefits do you think that that brings to the higher education profile of your students compared to those that may live off campus?
So I think certainly in a residential liberal arts college, we think about a lot of the learning taking place outside of the classroom. Certainly, we also think a lot of it takes place inside the classroom, obviously, but we do think that students interacting outside of the classroom, running into faculty, running into staff, playing in athletics, participating in clubs is all very important. And we think by having them live on campus that we can really leverage that. Once a student chooses to live off campus, we've kind of lost them for half of the day and we've lost their interaction with each other. One of the things that we've done over the last 10 or 15 years is significantly increase the diversity of our student body. That only brings benefits if the students are actually interacting with each other. And again, our experience has been that that's a little easier for students to do in a mediated place like a classroom, but it's also incredibly important for them to learn how to do it outside of the classroom, living with each other. And if we let them all go off and live off campus, they'll pretty much self-select with kids that look more or less like themselves and not get that added educational benefit.
Do you want to add to that, Stan?
I would like to add a few things to that. I guess certainly one of the reasons I'm such a fan of the small residential liberal arts college community is, in fact, what we do perceive as the benefits of what I would call 24-hour day, 7-day a week total immersion. I think there are benefits that come out of that. And not just for the students, it's, I think, for the entire community. And I think it for the institution, it tends to create bonds that are very strong. People, I think, that come out of that environment tend to stay close friends and probably as alumni, fellow alumni in a class are in close communication at age 50 and 55 and 60 and are donating to their institution at a level that they never would if they never lived on campus and really never had a sense of community with their friends. So I think everybody can benefit from that. So I think there's just both an educational and a social benefit for that kind of total immersion. So I guess at Wooster, one thing we really loved was the fact that our location in Northeast Ohio meant that we drew students from New York and Connecticut and students from Southern Ohio. And living in a residence hall as roommates to take a kid who'd gone to a prep school in New England and put them with the kid who raised hogs in a 4-H farm in Southern Ohio and have them live to 9 months together in a residence hall and then with people on the hall with similarly broad backgrounds was a huge part of their education. And I think a lot of that kind of exposure and experience is lost if there isn't that kind of total immersion in a resident situation. So I think there are just so many potential benefits that accrue from that kind of environment.
Other questions? And please, thanks, Ed. Let me also say that please don't be intimidated by the walk to the mic. If anyone wants to just raise their hand, I can repeat the question through this microphone, and I'm sure that would be fine. So please, we'll start with you, Ed.
I've never met a microphone I didn't like. We thank you, first of all, for being here at St. Mary's, and I appreciated your opening comments to the questions. For over 20 years, we've been hearing how the digital age has been a disruptive set of influences on higher education, and that's true. My question is actually the opposite. Is there a role in higher education to train students through their liberal education and the critical thinking skills we give them is there a role in guiding them to be the disruptive agents in the technological world that they're going to graduate into?
Tough question. Okay, let me take a fair crack at it.
Yeah.
I guess I like to think that one of the intellectual characteristics of students that come out of this kind of institution, disruptive may be a little stronger than the word that I'd use, but I'm willing to accept it, but at least somewhat rebellious, independent thinkers who don't take anything for granted, who are willing to listen and learn and watch and talk with other people about it, and who then take all of that and sort of chart their own course and contribute to a lot of fields, whether it be technology or whatever, with fresh ideas and fresh perspectives, and one would hope improve along the way. Now, yes, you're going to find some people who unfortunately have a destructive streak in that regard, but set them aside. The whole point, I think, is to cultivate in your students that the kind of creativity, somewhat rebellious, somewhat disruptive, but hoping that the way by which you do it also makes them want to be positive contributors to that. So they use their creativity and their possible inclination toward disruption to shake things up enough so they get better rather than worse. So I think, yes, I would hope that that would be the case. And of course, the atmosphere on the campus can contribute to whether or not they do it from a positive or negative point of view.
Yeah, I think our students are growing up with technology, and in a way, over time, will figure out how it can add to the value of their lives and in which ways it doesn't, and will help shape it going forward. I mean, as I watch students over the last decade, some technologies have come and gone, at first captivating them, and then I see them reject it as not being positive in their lives. And so I think there'll be an interaction between our students as they graduate and go out into the world and the technology world, and like other services and goods, the ultimate consumers of them will help drive what's successful and what isn't.
Today I've spent the better part of the day in a small school, LaSallian school, over in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. So that experience is still with me as I'm sitting here. One of the things that they do, it's a school from 4th through 8th grade, they have clearly articulated student learning expectations. That things like integrity, compassion, leadership, responsibility, perseverance. These learning expectations are integrated into the curriculum. They're integrated into their award ceremonies. They're integrated throughout the life while the children are in school. Should this stop? Is that me?
Yes.
Sorry. I should.
Good timing.
Somebody's telling me to shut up. Did it stop? I'm sorry.
That's a
Can you turn that thing off?
yeah.
Technology.
Disruptive technology.
Should-
is,
Wants to beat us
Should these kinds of things stop at middle school or high school, or is there a role for this kind of thing in
but-
liberal arts colleges?
and just because of the interruption, these kinds of things are the kind of
Things like the
values-based.
student
More
learning
values.
Yeah,
expectations, integrity, a focus, an intentional focus on integrity, leadership, responsibility, whatever they may be, perseverance, or the ones that I'm reminded of right now.
I would say that all of those things are things that we expect students to continue to learn about in a liberal arts setting. It's not that we so much articulate them or actually teach them to the students, but through the way we've organized their days, 24 hours, 7 days a week, in terms of taking on responsibilities for living together with people they don't know and who are from different backgrounds, to playing on teams together and having to work together with students that you don't necessarily, other students you don't necessarily know, to running 130 different clubs with students needing to take on leadership and financial responsibility for running those. Certain codes of conduct standards that students then adjudicate other students' behavior when they stray outside of those. So through I think that living all of the ways that we ask our students to live, we're asking them to practice almost all of those values without kind of preaching to them about them. Sorry.
You raise an interesting issue, though, because at least amongst the broad range of American institutions, say 4,200, something like that, some institutions have chosen to have consciously a well-described, what they call honor system, that often especially has to do with taking tests and so forth. Other institutions have never even talked about it or thought about it. Now, that may be for several different reasons. It may be in some cases because they already assume and believe, maybe with good reason, that there's no need to do that because the students can be completely trusted to act as if there were an honor system. In other schools, there may not be that assumption. They may just say it's not worth trying. But you've put your finger on it, the issue of integrity. And it really is interesting across American higher education. The range of places that either do or don't have honor systems, and I think it'd be a wonderfully interesting study to find out, perhaps from the history of the institution, what led to them either to take on or not to take on an honor system, and why, and are there any relationships with that decision with religious background of the institution or other kinds of backgrounds of the institution? Is there a correlation with that decision with other aspects of the institution? So you made me think about honor systems. And yes, some schools do it consciously, others don't even think about it.
I want to lower the conversation a little bit. I'm Father John Morris, teach here in the college. I've had a good career. I've taught at the Angelicum in Rome. I've taught at the Graduate Theological Union, and I've enjoyed 35 years here. So I enjoy the liberal arts education. But here's my lowering the conversation a little bit. When I went to school, which was right after they invented dust, I could earn enough money to go to college for the whole year. I didn't work at all, anytime. So I could pay room, board, and tuition with a couple $100 from my parents at the end, and so forth. So my question is, that can't be done anymore. We all know that. And I know there's all kinds of external things that affect that. But I'm more interested in us, our liberal arts colleges. Have we committed any? I'm very generous tonight. I'm willing to give absolution for the sins of our colleagues here. But is there anything that we have done as liberal arts colleges that have not impeded this impossible situation where what used to be the really great equalizer, kid coming from a lower income family could break out, and now that just seems to be impossible without going to incredible debt. So is there something that we as a liberal arts school have done or not done to work against that particular situation? I know that's kind of a tough question because there are all kinds of things outside of us that work against us. But have we committed any sins that we might correct at this point to make that cost of education a little more reasonable to the kids coming from lower middle class and middle class families?
Again, I think individual institutions are making decisions about how much of their resources to allocate to need-based financial aid. Amongst the private nonprofits with high graduation rates, we have the highest share of Pell Grant students, according to the New York Times. And the only schools that are higher actually on their ranking are the UC systems, which have done quite well in terms of both graduating students and getting low-income students. But again, I think one of the so more schools can do that. and that would be a good thing. Why don't they do it? I would go back to the conditions that we're facing in the economy with the increasing income inequality and catering on some level to the very top end. But to be honest, we've always done that. If you go back and look at where many of our schools recruited students from, it was from the private high schools or the city high schools from wealthy communities. And it was really only in the 60s and 70s where a lot of our kinds of schools started recruiting lower income kids in large numbers to come. And then all of a sudden that became more difficult to do. And many institutions have stayed committed to it, but it's difficult. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think our schools could try harder not to compete for the very highest income kids, pushing up our costs, making it more difficult for for us to support lower income kids to come. But any one school that does it on their own is slightly at risk, because then kids will go to the schools that are, kids and their families are shopping around, and they're going to see which school is investing the most in these amenities which they would like to have when they go to college.
The answer that I'd give represents a little bit of conflict in my own mind, because I've probably been on both sides of this issue and have probably landed from time to time on both sides. But and what I'm going to say is it comes out of the fact that there is a huge amount of competition for students amongst liberal arts colleges, and one decision that many have made is that one way they can compete for especially the best faculty, they think, and maybe for students too, is to have for the faculty the lowest possible teaching load, and hence the highest possible and the best possible faculty-student ratio, so that the faculty can publish with the same quality and rate that they do at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And so at some small liberal arts colleges, especially the most expensive, faculty members teach one and a half courses a semester, maybe two. Two is the absolute outside. That's a burdensome load to have 2 courses, when in fact 50 years ago it was 4. And so the faculty in fact could have been half the size 50 years ago, because the expectation for their research production was a lot lower. The school wasn't then trying to compete in research productivity with Harvard, Yale, or Princeton. They wanted students to have, the faculty would get sabbaticals, yes, they could do research in the summer, but they weren't expected to be writing papers every week all year long. Nowadays, especially amongst many strong liberal arts colleges, there is the expectation that you have to provide your faculty the time every single week to be writing their papers, so that they can, in fact, publish 4 or 5 papers a year, a book every 2 or 3. Now, there's value to that, yes, but unfortunately, it requires having a much, much bigger faculty than relative to what it perhaps used to be. And again, there's benefit in that too, but it does jack up the cost a great deal. And what I worry about, and always had worry about, is that I would rather have my faculty thinking about my students 80% of the time during the school year, and about their research at most 20%, whereas in fact the incentive now in too many schools is to have faculty thinking all academic year long 80% about their research and only 20% about their students. And I think that's a disservice to the students.
Good evening. I have a 2-part question about diversity in higher education. So first, looking at sort of demographics of students over the last several years, we do see increases in the number of, in diversity in our student population. So one question is, and I do agree as a dean of students that a lot of learning does happen outside of the classroom, but one question is, what do you see as the responsibility of higher education to provide intentional learning environments for student populations that are becoming much more diverse? The flip side of that is the workforce. So faculty and administration and staff across the country are still predominantly white. So what responsibility, or where do you think the responsibility lies for predominantly white administration to address institutional racism?
So I think we absolutely have to think about being more intentional about helping our students navigate difference, race, class, religion, a variety of aspects. I think it's easy to start by just saying, well, let's get these kids to our campuses and then they'll figure it out. And I think the answer is that it's really hard to figure it out and that we have to help them do it. And the other thing that we have to remember, and I think this is one of the things that sometimes you forget, is that each year 25% of your students are new. And so you have to be quite intentional about it. And something that you did 3 or 4 years ago might have been great, but all those kids are gone now. And so you need to start over again. In terms of, I'm never quite sure exactly what institutional racism means, but if you're thinking about the diversity of your faculty and staff, of course, one of the real challenges is if you don't have the pipeline working very well, if all of us went out looking for people, we're not going to find them. And so, I mean, I do think we need to think very carefully that we're setting up systems for hiring and supporting people that support everybody and give everybody a chance. But we also have to really focus on the pipeline and make sure we're getting kids in and kids out. I mean, if you look at the BA educational attainment rate by race and income, I think it's something like 45% of white kids are going on to higher ed. Latino males is like 11%. African American and Latinos on average is around 20%. So just huge disparities. And if you do it by income, it's something like 85% of the top third of the income distribution. Those kids are going on and getting a BA, and it's only about 50% of the kids in the bottom third of the income distribution. So it seems to me we just have to attack those numbers and improve them.
There's one mechanism that many schools, like my own College of Wooster in Ohio, schools especially in rural locations, have found to be useful and also maybe actually essential. And that's a program that you may know about called the POSSE program. I'm not sure if that's, you know, the POSSE program. It's probably not used as much in urban environments simply because schools in urban environments have a greater call and it's easier for a young person in a high school in an urban environment to think about going a little ways away to an more urban school. But if you're in Northeast Ohio in a very agricultural area, for a young person in Chicago or New York or Miami, Brooklyn, to come to rural Ohio is a much larger jump. And so the POSSE program was started by just a wonderfully creative woman to find ways to go into more urban high schools and identify a group of maybe 9, I think 9 is the canonical number, 9 students all of whom would like to apply to and go together to this particular small college. So that going as a group, they bring with them a good batch of the culture which they've come up with and can take into the institution. And so they're, in a way, going to be more likely to survive because they have some friends who understand them. At the same time, the institution gets to import a piece of American culture they wouldn't get otherwise. So everyone benefits in this situation. And our school now has 2 or 3 POSSE groups. I think one aimed more at African Americans, one at Hispanics. And it's been extremely successful, and it's a program now adopted by an awful lot of small, more rurally located liberal arts colleges. It's a great idea. Where the number 9 came from, I don't know. Maybe it's sort of the minimum useful to give that body of influence.
Hello, my name is Rosemary Graham. I'm in the English department here at St. Mary's, and I've been here for a couple of decades. I'm also the parent of a senior in high school making a decision about where to go to college. And so the issue of the price and the cost has been something we've really been looking at. And as a parent, I was very happy to see the database that came out from the federal government in the fall. And I was very unhappy to see the letter to the editor from the College Presidents Association president talking about how we shouldn't even be talking about salaries that our graduates are earning, and the opposition. I know, Catherine, you talked about you were not opposed to the efforts to publicize some of that. One of the things that I haven't heard tonight when we're asking about the cost or price of education is the bureaucracy that that our institution, the bureaucratic, the increase in bureaucracy that's happened in my 2 decades here. I have problems sometimes with an advisee, with a student, and I really don't know whom to call. Or I might think I know whom to call, but that office has changed name, changed the head. We seem to have a lot of acronyms around this college these days too. Things are always kind of changing. I've heard you talk about faculty salaries, faculty wanting light teaching loads, but I think the thing that well, I just haven't heard it tonight. And there was a story this summer. I heard it on the radio, and I have not been able to track it down because I thought it was NPR, but maybe it was the NewsHour. And it was one of the Pennsylvania colleges. It might have been Franklin and Marshall who made a decision to really cut back on the size of the institution in terms of employees, and to consciously put more money into financial aid, and the result was a more diverse student body. Maybe one of you knows which institution that was, but so I'm making more of a comment than I am asking a question, but that's something that I would like to hear discussed more here at St. Mary's. We're not teaching 1.5 courses a year. Anyway, there you have it.
I can talk a little bit about the non-faculty staff. I think it has grown significantly over time. I think some of it comes from a bunch of different places. Some of it is just straight federal and state regulation these days in terms of data requirements, and I'm assuming that at St. Mary's you've been talking about Title IX issues. I mean, that's led to many institutions having to hire 2 or 3 more people. And to be perfectly honest, in any case that you have, one of the 2 sides is probably going to end up suing the institution. So you end up with, costs associated with that as well. I think there's some other things that have led to increased non-faculty staffing, which are good things. I think we actually have more students coming to our institutions with learning issues or differences and/or mental health issues, or health issues where 20 or 30 years ago they would not have made it onto higher education. They are now, and yet they need more support at the institution to make it possible for them to get through. But then I would say that the third part goes back to the arguments that I've made before about just competing through supplying services. Many of our institutions now do have career development offices, which we didn't have before. That's 4 or 5 people. I'm getting incredible pressure from the families of the kids at my school that those services still aren't good enough, and they want more. So trying to resist those, you can, but there will be, repeated pressure to continue to add services, more sports teams, more counseling, technology. I thought your question was going to go in a different way. An earlier question. Technology has mostly added to our costs, not reduced our costs. Maybe things will change in 10 years, but up until now, it's been not only stuff, but I've got a technology office with 20 people. 40 years ago, I didn't have anybody in that office, so it's challenging. So I think it's on the federal regulation side. There are schools that are trying to lobby the government to pull back on some of those things, but some of those regulations are okay, I think it's okay that we're asking that our young women should feel safe on college campuses. So it's some of it could go, sure, but what would you put out there? What should we get rid of? I do think some of the things that are on on the amenity side, again, I think tackling those are exactly like tackling other things. There has to be incentives for schools to pull back on those. And again, in my mind, the best way to do that is to create incentives for schools to spend money on need-based financial aid, because every dollar we allocate to that, we can't allocate to something else. And the first place we're going to look to cut is going to be those amenities. It's not going to be the heart and the soul of the institution. So anything we could do to create incentives for that, I think, would move us in that direction.
I'm probably a naive optimist in a way, like I think Catherine is, in the sense that I don't think I was, and I don't think I've ever met a fellow college president who just loved to keep adding administrators. That was not something they went to work every day hoping to do. I think in virtually every case I know, any additions of that sort were made because of requirements, either competitive requirements, as she suggests, or federal requirements, or just a series of pressures that make you finally come to the point, well, we have to do this or we're going to lose our position in certain ways. And an example that, and also various aspects of professionalization. And athletics is a good example of that. When I was in college, a good half of the athletic teams were coached by faculty members who took the afternoon off to coach, as happens in many high schools these days. The mathematics teacher goes out at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and coaches the football team, or the basketball team, or the soccer team, and then is back in the classroom the next morning. So there's a doubling up of responsibility. And almost no college that I know of my type does that happen in any way now. Most of the sports have a head coach and 2 assistant coaches, because, as Catherine suggests, the parents expect that you're going to have as professional a college athletic program as you possibly can afford. And the idea of asking a professor to take the afternoon off to coach an athletic team would just be anathema in terms of your competition with other institutions. So that's one of the kinds of responses that I think people respond to those kinds of pressures.
We're almost out of time. I do want to bring up one other subject before we stop for the night. That's not unrelated. It's another cost center at institutions. I don't really want to ask about the cost exactly, but I wonder how much each of you has thought over the years about the evolving preparation is one way of thinking about it of incoming students. And maybe even beyond that, the evolving ways in which students learn. We talked a little bit about technology before, the different sort of levels of preparation, I guess, for what we currently have in our curriculum for incoming students.
So we've, I would say that I think a couple of things have been going on. Having diversified our student body, both in terms of income and race, we are definitely getting a greater share of kids from under-resourced high schools. And they are coming very talented, good grades, good test scores. They are coming having had significantly less experience reading and writing over and over. So we're finding that students are coming with less strong writing skills, and we're needing to invest more in that in the opening part of the school year. I also think that even across higher education, had we not changed the demographics of our student body, the increased emphasis on testing in schools is leading to kids having successfully gotten through high school by taking tests. And all of a sudden they show up on our steps, and that's not what we're doing, really. Mm-hmm. We're asking them to think and to write and solve problems and be creative and innovative. And they kind of go like, wait, don't I just need to learn this stuff and give it back to you? And so we actually end up having to break that cycle as well.
That's a tough issue. I think one thing that I know College of Wooster tried to do, but it's an old program, was started not with the purpose that I'm going to talk about, but has the effect of that purpose now. Every senior at the college is expected to do, as part of their regular work, a truly serious independent study project that probably is more like a master's thesis than you might find anywhere else. But they're not expected to be able to do that cold turkey as seniors. the expectation for that is the first thing they hear during their first week of orientation at school. And so especially if students have come in, as you say, maybe somewhat hand-fed or test-fed, whatever, they're told right away that you are no longer simply a responder. You have to learn as quickly as possible to be an originator and a writer and a reader more than you've ever been before. And so there's a first-year seminar where baby steps are taken to completely transform the student's attitude toward their education, not just to be a responder, but to be an originator. And then that's tried to carry through in the sophomore and junior year. So it's an attempt to provide that. It's like the shake-up of getting your first F on your first freshman year paper. Oh, I guess I'm not as good as I thought I was. It's in a way to say to them, this is a whole new world, and you're expected to change your orientation towards it. And that's as effective to the good student, the bad students as to the good, I think, in that regard. I know we're near the end. I want to take a personal time to embarrass my friend Ted Sukahara back there. I probably wouldn't be here if it weren't for the fact that we joined the Pomona faculty about the same time in 68 for him, 67. And for a mathematics professor and an economics professor to get along as well as we did and publish together a little bit and do things as families together and then separate his going one way or another. Here we are 47 years later, and I'm really pleased to be here. Ted, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's probably a good way to stop. So in addition to Ted, I would like to thank our guests so much for being here and donating your wisdom and your time to our group here tonight. So thank you and good night.